The difference between talking and doing when it comes to terrorism, immigration, and running for president. Tonight on Washington Week.
All of us have a responsibility to refute the notion that groups like ISIL somehow represent Islam, because that is a falsehood that embraces the terrorist narrative.
A war against terrorism devolves into a war about definitions.
These are Islamic extremists. These aren't animal lovers. These aren't environmental advocates.
Why this war is about so much more than boots on the ground. At home, a federal judge in Texas halts the president's immigration reform plan, delaying action in 26 states.
We cannot fail our fellow Texans. We must do what the federal government has failed to do. We must secure our border.
And Jeb Bush steps into the deep end of the pool, making a case for the kind of president he would be.
Each president learns from those who came before, their principles, their adjustments. One thing we know is this: every president inherits a changing world and changing circumstances.
But can he escape the shadows cast by his father and his brother? Covering the week, Michael Crowley, senior foreign affairs correspondent for POLITICO. Nancy Youssef, senior national security correspondent for the Daily Beast. Pete Williams, justice correspondent for NBC News. And John Dickerson, chief political correspondent and political director for Slate and CBS.
Award-winning reporting and analysis, covering history as it happens. Live from our nation's capital, this is Washington Week with Gwen Ifill. Once again, live from Washington, moderator Gwen Ifill.
Good evening. The week in terror began early on Saturday with shootings in Copenhagen. It took a horrific turn the next day with the release of a video showing the beheadings of 21 Egyptian Coptic Christians. And then within 24 hours, armed retaliation from Egypt. What better time, then, for a White House summit on extremism, albeit one that demonstrated how degrading ISIS is more complicated than it seems. The problem, as the president sees it, is that the terrorists, also known as the Islamic State, are desperate for legitimacy.
They try to portray themselves as religious leaders, holy warriors in defense of Islam. That's why ISIL presumes to declare itself the Islamic State. We must never accept the premise that they put forward, because it is a lie.
The problem, as the president's critics see it, is that the White House refuses to use the label Islamic terrorism. And therein lies part of the explanation of why the challenge presented by ISIS is so multi-layered, Michael.
It really is. And the president is really sticking to his guns on this one. It's interesting because back in September, the White House was criticized for not saying we were at war with ISIS, and they didn't want that political fight, and they stepped back from it and said, fine, we're at war. This is not a fight we want to have. In this case, the president really stuck to his guns. I think he believes strongly, 3 reasons here, not to use the language that people want him to use and to stick with this more generic language, violent extremism. One is don't give ISIS the fight that it wants. You heard him saying that in that clip just there. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who's the self-proclaimed caliph, he wants to appear to be leading Muslims in this apocalyptic war against the West and Christianity. And Obama just doesn't want to play on those terms, doesn't want to enhance his standing and accept his frame. The other is that we have to be very sensitive about the perception in the Muslim world that there is some degree of kind of anti-Muslim animus in the United States, that there is some kind of war against Muslims, and that America cares less about Muslim lives, is quicker to bomb Muslim countries, and I think that's a sensitivity. The third is I think the president sincerely believes something that's statistically true, which is that terrorism and violent extremism in this country is not predominantly Muslim. We have all kinds of terror attacks by people of all stripes. You have Christian radicals, people who have all kinds of obscure agendas. There's a guy who flew a small plane into a building, I think in Arizona several years ago. So a lot of this extremism that we want to target, people who may be starting to lose it, people who we want communities to be keeping an eye on, are not necessarily Muslim.
Nancy, at this extremism summit at the White House this week, there were people from all over the world, representatives of countries from all over the world there. How did they address this problem?
Well, it's interesting. In the region, the term that's used is Daesh, which is the Arabic acronym for Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. And what's interesting is that people at the summit were asking for a more nuanced discussion. In the region, you'll hear a lot of discussion about the interpretation of Islam because they're bombarded with messaging from ISIS that they are defending the state. And so it's interesting the kind of dialogue that's happening in the region. It's not about the name or whether it's extremist or not because it's a Muslim-dominated society, but how and who can interpret the faith. We saw this with the killing of the Jordanian pilot, Lieutenant Kasespa, when King Abdullah came out and said that he was the one who was defending Islam, not the terrorists. We saw this with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, when he came out and said that we need to come up with a way to reclaim the faith. And so it's interesting, here we talk about the language, and there they're really talking about the religion and how and who can claim to own its message.
Michael, this debate in the White House was kind of taken over by the semantic question, but what was actually accomplished with this meeting?
I think that's a good question. Very little. I don't think you're going to see big policy changes coming out of it. You know, ahead of this summit, there was some reporting about how the State Department is increasing its efforts at social media outreach and trying to promote moderate messages. And that is obviously a very worthy and important mission. But the dollar figures are pretty trivial. And what you're really talking about is tweeting and sending links around.
Which is not the heart of the problem.
It's not the heart of the problem. We are also trying to get moderate preachers in the Muslim world to promote a more moderate message. And that can work to some degree. But you also hear from people in the region, some of the people who are most likely to do that are seen as pawns of the governments that groups like ISIS are already fighting, so it's really hard.
Nancy, how is ISIS militarily doing, though? It seems like they're making gains in Iraq.
Yes, so we heard this week from the Pentagon that they plan to go after them in Mosul, which is Iraq's second biggest city, the place where the coalition was sort of born after ISIS was able to move in and take the city on June 10th of last year. The Pentagon came out and said this week that it would take 25,000 Iraqi and Kurdish troops to take on 2,000 Islamic State fighters in a city in which they are deeply entrenched, in which they own most of the land. They've literally got trenches and barriers. They charge taxes for residents. They provide security. And so it will be the most challenging battle to reclaim the country from the Islamic State.
I just quickly ask, normally the Pentagon likes the element of surprise. Why are they talking about this in advance?
Well, there are a lot of different theories that came out of the building this week. One of them was that they didn't release anything tactical. The other is that they want to let ISIS know that they are going to face a threat. The third theory is that they wanted to bolster the Iraqi army and the Iraqi government and sort of encourage them and let them know that they were backed by the United States and that they were going to go in and fight, and sort of that this was going to be a national effort to reclaim the city.
You know, one of the things I found interesting about the debate about the terminology and also about this conference, Michael, was that we don't know how to use the language of conventional warfare and unconventional war. And that seems to be at the root of a lot of the layers of discussion about how complicated this idea of degrading and defeating ISIS is.
Yeah, and, you know, the State Department Deputy Spokeswoman Marie Harf got in some trouble, or let's say caused controversy earlier this week when she said, you can't kill your way out of this problem. We can't just keep killing them. And she suggested that economic development and other measures were really important to solving the long-term problem. And
Which actually is what we heard Susan Rice and other people, and the president getting to.
And I think that was also a position of George W. Bush and many people in his administration. It's not a crazy thing to say. It may not have been the most ideally articulate way to frame it, but it goes to this idea that this is a very complicated conflict. It's not just a simple battlefield where you claim we may, recapture Mosul and that would be great, but there are so many other elements to it, and so it just makes for a more complicated debate. And of course, people are going to get tripped up in semantics, and we're going to have partisan controversy as a result.
Remember, in the Bush administration, they tried to rename suicide bombing homicide bombing as a way to try and change.
That didn't stick, as I recall.
That didn't stick either. Michael, you talked about how this map of this fight is changing and different and weird. Was there talk about domestic U.S. terrorism or lone wolves showing up in the United States?
Yeah, I actually think that's, to me, it's a slightly more practically addressable problem, which is that the global problem is so vast. But here at home, what can the government do to try to reach out and integrate its law enforcement efforts in communities that they think are vulnerable to this kind of recruitment. But the problem is it's so sensitive and difficult. We think about this conference as being attacked by conservatives on the right who say you're not using the right language. There's a lot of blowback. I wrote about this week for Politico from civil liberties groups and Muslim groups in the U.S. saying you're essentially trying to create new forms of surveillance, infiltrate our communities under the guise of this warm and fuzzy outreach, but inevitably you're targeting us, you're surveilling us. So it gets complicated and controversial very fast.
Nancy, in the region, especially after something like the beheadings that happened in Libya, right there on the Mediterranean coast, just stone's throw, as it were, from Italy, has this radicalized or gotten the attention of countries who basically thought this wasn't their problem?
Well, it's interesting. In this case, it was Egyptians that were killed. And before this, Egypt wasn't officially part of the 60-member coalition. And their argument was, we don't need to fight the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. We've got the Islamic State in the Sinai, in the east, and in Libya on our western border. And that, frankly, USA, we need your support in that fight. And the U.S. has been quite hesitant. And so what it really exposed this week is the debate of what defines the Islamic State. The United States will say that the Islamic State is not in Libya because these are just groups taking the name and inspired by them and aren't necessarily members. But for the
Is that a difference without a distinction? I mean, Boko Haram is not technically Islamic State, but it's certainly inspired in the same bloody kind of way.
Right. What constitutes a caliphate terror state? The Egyptians would say there is no difference. And so what we saw this week was the U.S. Hesitant to say that this was a justified strike inside Libya, because this is the other complication. The U.S. strategies say we need a political solution to stabilize Libya, not outside states intervening. And the Egyptians are saying this is an existential threat to us. We cannot just let it go. And so it's fascinating, the sort of push-pull. On one hand, we want a diplomatic and a political solution and the levers of democracy to solve this. And at the same time, in Iraq and Syria, the U.S. is using primarily military means to tackle the Islamic State. Is there a political
solution that was put on the table, or at least floated this week?
For
how the global community should be handling this?
Well, there's a political concept that the president articulated, and he essentially said that one of the key long-term solutions here is democracy, political freedom. That when you have repression, radicalism festers, And it's interesting because there's a school of thought that says actually what you need in the Middle East is strong men. And we may not like them, but people are nostalgic for Gaddafi and for Saddam. It's a tragic thing. But the president really reinforced that message that no, that's not the answer, because that can stabilize in the short term, but in the long term creates more resentment, more radicalism.
Okay, thank you both. Now to the courts. A federal judge in Texas set the stage this week for the next challenge to the president's executive power. The issue at hand, Mr. Obama's decision to expand protections for millions of undocumented immigrants. The technique, arguing against the administrative underpinning of the president's plan. The result, a delay for the program that was supposed to go into effect this week. Pete, what was the judge's reasoning in all of this?
Well, in simple terms, he said the government went too far, that it was making the law instead of applying it. Now, the administration's argument has been that it was merely setting enforcement priorities, that it was letting these undocumented adults stay if they had children who were in the United States legally. But what the judge said, and they said, by the way, that they had to do this because they have limited resources and they wanted to focus on the biggest concerns, people who were criminals or potential terrorists. But what the judge said is, this isn't just the government isn't just turning its back on these people who are illegally. It's actually affirmatively reaching out to them. It's allowing them, it's saying, you will not be deported for the next 3 years. It's allowing them to get Social Security numbers. It's allowing them to get work permits, and that changes their status. Now, the administration's opponents had claimed that this is unconstitutional, that the president went too far, and they hoped the judge would base his ruling on that, but he didn't. He didn't go that far. What he said is that the reason he put a stay on it is that this is a rule change, and when you change the rules, you have to seek public comment, you have notice and comment, and that is why it was
almost like
had to be stopped. Very much a technicality, and that is why he put it on hold until the whole case is worked out.
I thought the White House is kind of casual in their reaction to this. Oh, we're going to appeal it, and we saw this coming because of who this judge is.
Well, there is something to that. There did seem a little bit of forum shopping here in going to a judge who is in South Texas who's had it up to here with immigration problems, and I don't think they were surprised that they got this ruling out of him. And you know, they knew that whatever was going to happen here was going to be appealed by one side or the other anyway.
Who was doing the forum shopping? Who were the injured parties here?
Well, there were 26 states who filed this lawsuit. Now, interestingly, the judge said only one of them actually had the standing, the right to bring this lawsuit, and that was Texas. And he said basically that the problem for Texas is they will be issuing driver's licenses to all these new people, and that costs Texas a lot of money.
So this ruling is even this ruling is even narrower than it looked?
Yes, well, because he said, you know, maybe the other states have standing. I'm not going to get to that. I am saying that for sure Texas has standing, and it's because of the license plate issue. That is the basis of the ruling.
You described a lot of legal twists and turns. So what does this mean for the appeal? Where do you think things stand in terms of the appeal? What should we expect to see?
Well, I would say in the next few days, the government will go to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals in Louisiana, and they will ask for an emergency stay on the judge's ruling. So it's a block of the block. That would mean that the law could go into effect. It was just this past week when people could start registering for this program, and the administration wants to get that going again.
How many people were we talking about, do we know?
Well, we're talking potentially about 3 or 4 million people that this could potentially cover. And then, of course, there was also, little noticed, the other part of the judge's ruling was the other part of the immigration program, which was expanding the original DREAM Act, the so-called DACA. It would cover more people. The judge also put a hold on that, and there were applications also for that. So the government wants to get that going again, and they're hoping that they can get the Fifth Circuit to at least let this go on while the legal fight continues.
And is there any kind of consensus among the constitutional scholars and legal geeks about how solid this ruling is, where the holes might be that they can poke in it?
Well, interestingly, both liberal and conservative legal scholars have been somewhat critical of this opinion. One of the problems is that immigration law and the enforcement of the law has always been the province of the federal government, and the states really don't have much wherewithal or legal right to challenge it. It would be a little like states going to court to challenge the administration's foreign policy. So that is a potential problem here. And then this whole theory about the notice and comment period may not be rock solid either.
But does it inadvertently provide the basis for a broader challenge to the president's executive action, which is really what his critics and conservative scholars want to do?
Well, remember, this whole fight this week was just about an injunction. The lawsuit itself, the straight-up attack on the president's constitutionality, is still pending. And so the judge has yet to rule on that. And let's face it, there are going to be other lawsuits, and this eventually will get to the Supreme Court.
Okay, thanks, Pete. There are many sticky questions to be answered before the 2016 presidential contest gets into full swing, like, what does Scott Walker really think about Rudy Giuliani? Or how will the Democrats manage Bill Clinton? What does Barbara Bush really think about Jeb? The former Florida governor sought to tackle at least one of those questions this week during his first big pre-campaign foreign policy speech.
Look, just for the record, one more time, I love my brother, I love my dad, and I admire their service to the nation and the difficult decisions that they had to make. But I'm my own man, and my views are shaped by my own thinking and my own experiences.
Clearly, this declaration happened for a reason. What was it, John?
Gwen, I love my brother and my dad, too, just so you know.
I might as well.
You know, usually in politics, when you have to declare you're your own man, it's a problem because somebody suggested there's a Rasputin behind the curtain or there are puppet strings. In this case, though, it's a very special case. His father and his brother were presidents, and so what he's trying to do is rush out from under their shadow, and that's for two reasons. One, President George W. Bush is still not that popular. The Iraq War with which he's associated is quite unpopular. But there's also something else, which is people don't want to think that a person is just kind of skating into the White House on a famous name. And Jeb Bush wants to kind of rattle people and say, pay attention, because in the end, people get excited about ideas and a message. If they just think he's kind of, just the next Bush in line, there's nothing for them to kind of put their hooks in. So shake them, awaken them, and say, I'm my own man, now listen to me.
Does Hillary Clinton kind of have to do the same thing in a different sort of way? If people are truly, if what we're seeing here is people are just exhausted by the dynastic nature of this campaign?
Well, she has a couple of problems. She's got the shadow of her husband that she has to deal with, and then her attachment to the existing White House, which is it has its own complexity, and particularly on foreign policy, has a lot of complexity because she essentially has to answer for a complicated world. And what we heard from Jeb Bush in this speech was a lot of clarity. America needs to be strong. It needs to do what it says. It needs to have strong alliances. It needs to have a strong economy with 4% growth that handles entitlements, that spends more on defense, and that spends more on research and development. This speech had everything for everyone in it. And if you campaign, Republicans have traditionally, in the polls, people think Republicans can handle foreign policy better. If you say, basically, I can solve the world, Hillary Clinton is stuck with the messy world that she was a part of trying to fix as a Secretary of State.
So how is he different from his brother?
Based on this speech, indistinguishable. Because this speech was a very vague speech. It was early in a campaign. He's not going to lay out his 5-point plan. He talked about some principles, as I mentioned, but they were just generally something everybody would love. And if you look at the speech, it is indistinguishable from his brother, his father, and basically mainstream Republican thinking about America needs to be strong. Although he did talk about balance and patience, which are words Barack Obama uses with respect to foreign policy and for which he's usually pilloried. One thing he did, there are two other things. One, the advisors he mentioned, or they put out a list of advisors that are talking to him and that he's talking to about foreign policy.
That's a lot of former Bush people, right?
I mean, they are people who are more familiar with the Bushes than the Gardeners at Versailles. I mean, this was a group of...
Who else are you going to select from, however?
That's exactly right. These are the last two Republican presidents. If you chose people not associated with the Bush family, it would they wouldn't fill this table. So finally, though, he did mention, Jeb Bush said there were mistakes made in Iraq. He said, one, the security situation after Saddam fell was bad. It created a vacuum. And he also said it was bad that weapons of mass destruction weren't found. People thought that was creating distance with his brother. It's what his brother has said in his own book.
But John, if he didn't say anything specific, and it's not real clear how he's different, what was the political benefit of such a speech? It's
a great question. The political benefit was he looked confident. He knew his brief. He knew that Tunisia was doing better than other Arab Spring states. He knew the president of Egypt. He knew... he sounded confident. And at this stage, and Barack Obama proved this, remember he was a freshman senator with no executive experience, if you sound confident, if you look like you know what you're talking about, then voters will say, oh, hey, he can be
He knew more than his brother knew at the similar point in the campaign.
In November of 1999, you'll remember George W. Bush was asked those 5 pop quiz questions about the leaders of the free world. He only got one right. Relative to where his brother was in 1999 at a later period in the campaign, Jeb Bush is miles ahead of him.
But John, say what you will about him, but I think Florida Senator Marco Rubio would probably ace that pop quiz. He's been on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He has learned up, and he came out right after Bush's speech and gave an interview and kind of raised his hand and tell people what he said and what that means for the presidential race.
That's right, an interview in Politico, and he basically said, I know I was right on the decision on Syria, on Libya, on Russia. And he was basically saying, much as Barack Obama did in 2008 when he said, I was right about the Iraq war, he's saying, I was prescient, and therefore that means I should be commander-in-chief. There's a big debate in the Republican Party about senators who may know the issues, but governors who have that executive experience. A lot of people think that's the most important thing.
And that's the question we're going to wait to see what sorts out, because they got a lot of governors or people who are thinking about running who are governors. So we'll see. Thank you, everybody. We have to go now. But as always, the conversation will continue online on the Washington Week Webcast Extra, where we'll talk, among other things, about that Rudy Giuliani question I asked about earlier. John. You can find that later tonight and all week long at pbs.org/Washington Week. Keep up with developments with me and Judy Woodruff on the PBS NewsHour, and we'll see you here next week on Washington Week. Good night.